Hello, everyone. My name is Andrew, and welcome back to Frames of Space. There's something kind of strange about what it's like to live through a crisis, which is that you often don't fully understand what you were wrong about until years later. In the moment, the choices feel obvious and the moral lines feel clear. You're responding to urgency and fear, and you're doing what seems reasonable inside the world that you inhabit. But then time passes, costs become more visible, and the trade-offs become more obvious than they were then. And sometimes you're left with an uncomfortable realization. Not that you were malicious or that you were careless, but more that your own social environment shaped what you were able to see in the first place. My guest today is Victor Kumar. He's a philosophy professor at Boston University and the writer behind the Substack, Open Questions. In recent years, he's become a lot more attentive to how intellectual cultures can form their own blind spots. One of the moments that shaped this shift for himself was the pandemic. Like many people in academic and professional circles, he supported long-lasting lockdowns and school closures, often without fully appreciating the downstream costs. Looking back, he doesn't frame this as a moral failure so much as a failure of his own perspective, a product of his own intellectual homogeneity. And that experience has informed how he now thinks about disagreement, dissent, and the kinds of arguments that get taken seriously in elite spaces. Because after all, how do we even know what we know? And who gets to decide which views are legitimate? That is one of the most important topics of today's episode, which is the question of how to balance openness with moral boundaries. Is it possible for us to rebuild intellectual trust along ideological lines, or will that just collapse into the suspicion and tribalism that we've come to expect? This conversation doesn't definitively settle those questions, but it is an attempt to sit with them. Now, here's my conversation with Victor Kumar. Victor Kumar, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, and it's great to be with you. Maybe we should start with a little bit of establishing who you are and what your political views are, because I think it's as important for this conversation. Would you describe yourself as a progressive? And if so, are you like a pretty bog standard progressive with all the progressive coded views?
Yeah, I would say I'm progressive and have been for most of my life. I think in recent years, my views have become more heterodox, and sometimes I have disagreements with common views on the left. But I would say that mostly I'm kind of a normie progressive. I mostly have um, very common views about many issues like abortion or gun control or trans issues. I think maybe what's more distinctive of me is I have a very wide Overton window. So I'm really interested in having discussions and debates with people really across the political spectrum.
I think it's kind of interesting when you say you have a wide Overton window. I feel like people like me and you, we use that term a lot, but I suspect that A, there's probably some people listening who don't know what it means, and
Mm.
B, I do think it's worth elaborating on. So like A, give the explanation for what an Overton window is, and B, you're an intellectual. Do you think intellectuals in America currently have like a pretty reasonable Overton window for deciding what views decide to like
Mm.
are allowed to make it into that window?
Yeah. So I think one common way of defining the Overton window is it's the range of views that are worth taking seriously and worth having, um, serious civil discussion about. And so views that are over outside the Overton window are sort of views that are like beyond the pale or that we wouldn't want to platform or communicate that we are worth taking seriously. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that among mainstream intellectuals on the left, there has, over the last decade or so, been a tendency to adopt more and more radical extremist views about things like policing or immigration and so on. But I think a more significant trend and more worrying trend to me is a restriction in the size of the Overton window, is like a narrowing of the range of views that are worth talking about and worth taking seriously.
There's a piece in one of your articles about this that I think is kind of fascinating, which is simply the idea that like even within academic circles, even if there is a narrow Overton window, there can be tons and tons of disagreement and tons of like what someone might consider to be a viewpoint diversity when it comes to the range of what is allowed in the discussion. So to quote you, this isn't about viewpoint diversity as such. As Barry Lamb observes in a recent essay about the Overton window, it's possible to have narrow ideological views, but allow for a wide range of reasonable disagreement. What does that mean?
Yeah. I mean, I think that, in a healthy intellectual culture, you want quite a wide range of political and ideological views. I think that's really healthy. It's good in itself, but it's also intellectually productive because we have different people exploring different parts of the intellectual space. So I think that um, people being ideologically narrow or extreme is kind of fine. That's what we want in a diverse intellectual culture. What is more problematic is people who have narrow views, but also don't brook any disagreement outside the space of those narrow views. So
So
like,
you
and I see,
like,
go ahead.
would you say that like Marxism is something that's like fine in your book?
I mean, I think Marxism is a totally reasonable approach to understanding how we should organize our economies. Myself, not super sympathetic to it, but I mean, I think, a good philosophy department, for example, should or a philosophical community like across many departments should have Marxists as representing that approach to economics and politics, political economy.
So then the problem is that the problem arises when the range of what views you consider to be reasonable is too narrow.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, I think you could imagine like two people, both of them have very narrow ideological views, but one of them responds to disagreement by casting aspersions on the person they're speaking to, um, questioning their motives, morally blaming them. The other person has the same kind of ideological perspective. They're just much more open to disagreement with people who fall outside that perspective. And so that's kind of like the difference between having narrow views but a wide Overton window.
Yeah. So you currently write a Substack known as Open Questions. Tell me why. Like, what motivated you to want to start that Substack?
It's a great question. Yeah, so I think I'm a philosophy professor, and I've become quite frustrated over the last 4 or 5 years or so with the ways in which other philosophers and academics approach intellectual questions. Um, questions about like what kind what kind of reforms we want to policing, or what's the ideal set of immigration policies. Um, to me, um, there's been a growing tendency among philosophers and other academics to really refuse to have open-minded discussions about these questions in which they not just listen to the other side, but take a charitable view about what the other side thinks and why they think it, and whether there might actually be reasonable arguments on the other side. So I think like one example of this that, has struck me many times is the extreme uh, lack of charity extended towards those who favor trans exclusive views, who favor views on trans issues that are out of step with mainstream progressive orthodoxy. And I think that, as somebody who generally has trans inclusive views, I I am sort of on the side of the mainstream progressive left, but I think there's plenty of room for disagreement. There's people who, for example, think that um, trans women shouldn't be allowed to participate in women's sports, or that they who have serious questions about whether trans women should be allowed to uh, be in women's shelters or women's prisons. I think people have reasonable arguments for those positions, and we really lose something if we don't listen to people on the other side, and if we automatically assume that disagreeing with mainstream views is transphobic. And it's not just that we do them a harm, we do ourselves an intellectual harm too, because we don't understand whether our own views are right, or how to respond to the best objection to our views, because we are just totally blind to the possibility of reasonable disagreement.
So you keep gesturing to this, but I want to make it official. I want to make it as transparent as possible. Obviously, you're a professor at like Boston University. You're surrounded by academics on a regular basis. What are the political views of the people who tend to be part of your social circle?
I would say it's almost exclusively people who range from the center left to the far left. Um, there are here and there people who are on the center right, and maybe there's more of them than I think, and maybe they just tend to be quieter or tend to let other people assume what their political views are without correcting them. But in general, in academia, almost everyone falls within the range of centrist to extreme left wing on most political issues.
How do you think that that has affected you? Do you feel like you've ever made the like mistakes or the wrong decisions in the past as a result of the disproportionate political leanings of the people within your own social circle?
Absolutely. And it may have happened many more times than I'm aware of. I think one of the main examples that comes to mind here is the way that many people on the left and center left reacted to the COVID pandemic and the restrictions and policies that were put in place in the months and years after the pandemic began. You know, I think that a lot of us reflexively opposed the Trump administration's response to the pandemic, their opposition to restrictions on social and economic activity. And because of that, people on the left, just thought, well, we've got to follow the science. We've got to mask up and we've got to shut things down indefinitely. Many people on the left thought that schools should continue to be shut down and online only into 2021, 2022. And in hindsight, I think, that was a mistake, that we failed to see all the big costs of these social and economic restrictions, in part because of our own privilege. Many of us were laptop workers who could just continue doing our jobs, continue getting paid, even though things were kind of even in the face of these social and economic restrictions. But lots of people suffered. People, they lost their businesses, they lost their houses, and I think it may still be true that the restrictions were justified, but I think we weren't alive to the very strong arguments for opening up our economy, for opening up schools.
Or you were insignificantly cognizant, you were insufficiently cognizant of the major costs that would come from refusing to open up.
That's right. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Yeah, that does make me wonder because I don't know how old the like my audience thinks that I am, but I'm gonna be doxing myself and say that I was part of university during large swaths of the
Hmm.
pandemic, and so like I experienced a lot of the stuff about like school closures or the rules around masks and vaccines. I experienced that firsthand, and it just make me sympathetic to a lot of the takes that you have about the mistakes that people in academia made during the pandemic. But I think that there's a tendency I notice. I don't really know how to fully form it, so I'm gonna try to word vomit onto you to hear your
Mm.
take. But I think that sometimes people learn the right lesson at the wrong time. You know how there are tons and tons of people, whether it be like within the tech sector or even like conservatives within journalism, where they were rightfully afraid of the rise of Donald Trump throughout the 2016 election. and to like even to the like for the 2020 election, even if it was to a slightly lesser extent. But like by the time the 2024 election had rolled around, even though Trump had shown his true colors time and time again with things like January 6th, they were still a lot more willing to vote for Trump during 2024 compared to 2016 or 2020. And I'm sure that if you were to ask them, they would bring in many of the reasonable criticisms that you have about academia's like narrow Overton window or the mistakes that the left made during the pandemic. And they would use that reasonable criticism to justify doing something that I think is much worse, which is like explicitly supporting an authoritarian. So do you think that you might be taking the right lessons you learned and applying them in a wrong like in the wrong time period since now it's a few years later. The pandemic doesn't really matter to people's lives anymore. So you might be taking the right lessons that you learned back then and applying them in the wrong time where it doesn't really matter anymore.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think right now in early 2026, we're living through a moment where Trump and his administration is eroding the rule of law domestically, internationally, politically, going after people, using ICE agents to brutalize and kill people on the streets. And so I think it's a fair point to say, well, listen, you got to keep our eye on the ball here. The enemy is Trump and right-wing extremists. Um, I think that I think it's right that is the most serious problem right now. But I think it's not just a problem that we can combat in the moment. So in the moment, we need people to politically organize. We need lawsuits against things that the Trump administration is doing. But I think we also need another thing that we need to do long term is to cultivate a culture on the left that can draw people who are centrists and persuadable towards it. And that's the project that I see myself contributing to, which is like, how can we win adherence? How can we stop people from seeing as Trump and other extremists as the lesser of two evils, which is, I think, why many people voted for him in 2024, because they were, it's not, I think many people didn't love Trump, but they just thought he was better than the alternative. And so I think part of what we want to do is to build up the alternative and make left-wing culture, progressive culture healthier in ways that can erode the ability of extremists to take power in further election cycles.
Do people within your social circle ever think of you as like a both sides sellout?
I think so. I think so. I mean, probably many people don't say that to me to my face, but occasionally I do see that kind of attitude on social media. I mean, I think it's unfortunate because I don't think that both sides are the same. I think that the Republicans in the U.S. and more broadly, conservative culture is right-wing culture has a lot more problems than the left. But I don't think that that should stop you from engaging in self-criticism. Just because one side is worse than the other doesn't mean that the other side is free of problems and immune to criticism.
All right. Maybe now is a good time to use the stuff that you said to sort of maybe now is to just like continue to paint a picture about the state of civic culture within the US. Like you would refer to the political polarization that's going on right now as like a fragmentation of American society. A, is that accurate? And B, what do you mean? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that American political culture has fragmented just in the way that so much of American culture is fragmented because we're all, trained by algorithms to attend to different sources of information. We're in different Discord groups, or people of your generation are. Um, and I think there's one kind of standard explanation for this about how the left and the right are being pulled further and further apart, which is that they're in different bubbles. They're only exposed to people from their own side, and they don't know what the other side thinks. And I think in some ways that explanation gets it exactly wrong. That the problem is we're too exposed to the other side. We, on social media, for example, the algorithms feed us parts of the other side that make us outraged. And, you get a lot of quick clicks and followers by quote tweeting or stitching videos that present the most lunatic views on the other side. And so I think social media, the problem with social media is not that it pulls us too far apart. This is true of traditional media too. It's that it exposes us to the worst of the other side. And that's at least part of the dynamic that is causing this fragmentation between left and right, between liberals and leftists in American political culture.
Throughout the 2016, 2020, and 2024 elections, there was this sense of existentialism, the idea that everything was under siege and that everything is under threat. And like a lot of people, I think this applies to both Democrats and Republicans, but I think since we're both Democrats, we can talk about the way that it was talked about within Democratic circles. People kept referring to the 2016 and then the 2020 election and then the 2024 election as like the most important election of our lifetime. There was this sense of like hyping up how dangerous it was and hyping up the level of existentialism. Do you think that they were right to do so, or do you think that they were incorrect when they referred to those elections as the most important elections of our lifetimes?
Well, I mean, I think, in theory, it could be correct that up until 2016 was the most important one, and then that became the second most important election once 2020 rolled around. I do, and I guess I'm quite sympathetic to the idea that 2024 is very important, given the way in which Trump and his administration is eroding democratic rule in this country and, um, you know, destroying diplomatic relations with other countries and economic cooperation and so on. So I'm drawn to I it doesn't sound crazy to me, but on the other hand, I also think that when it comes to political news, we are always very myopic. We can't see beyond about 10 feet beyond where we are right now. And everything that's happening right now feels like a disaster that is going to tear the world apart. But then, it often turns out that our political systems, our economic systems are more resilient than we think, and things are not quite so dire.
This is part of the reason why sometimes I don't focus that much on current events because I'm afraid that like if I record an episode on Monday, then it'll be drastically outdated by
Mhm.
Thursday. So like maybe seeing how the political situation in America has unfolded, like do you think that the level of existentialism that people had, like say in 2016 or 2017 about the rise of Trumpism, do you think that level of existentialism was vindicated or not?
I think it kind of was. I mean, he tried to steal the 2020 election, and uh, but for a few people resisting, like Pence and the governor of Georgia, he might have stolen it. Um, I think that there's a good case to be made that he spurred on this riot at the U.S. Capitol, where people were trying to find, and some people in that riot were trying to find and kill members of Congress. So I do think that Trump is a huge threat to American democracy, and I think that is just in and of itself a good enough reason to think of at least 2020 and 2024 as existential threats to the very existence of America as a democratic state.
So a few questions ago, you brought up the whole idea that everyone is living in their own bubble and they get exposed to like the worst aspects of the other side. So then my question is like, are there times where they get exposed to like accurate information and then they perceive it the same way that they might perceive like they perceive it they perceive that accurate information about the other side. It causes them to view that other side in the same negative light that they would be caused to view the other side even if they were exposed to inaccurate information about them.
Yeah, I mean it's it's not even that I think that people get exposed to inaccurate information. They just get exposed to a very selective slice of the information. So here's an example, and I talk about this a little bit in the essay that you read. Um, I think people on the left and the right had very different views of Charlie Kirk after his assassination a few months ago. And I guess I would not say that each side had inaccurate information. They just had a very selective slice of information about what Charlie Kirk was like. The left thought he was a hateful person who was a hate monger. And I think like, oh, that's kind of right. He did do that. He pretended to have civil conversations with people, but he was kind of farming out content to like in ways that like incited hate towards black people and trans people. And then people on the right say, well, but he was really speaking to people about their Christian faith and trying to communicate how to be a good husband and father. And it's like, yeah, that's right too. He was also doing that. People are complicated people. There's all these different facets to Kirk and many other people, many other major media figures. And so it's not that people get exposed to inaccurate information. They get exposed to selective slices of information. Now, I think that if you have access to a less selective, slice of information, if you, for example, read conservative authors trying to give you a different perspective on who Charlie Kirk was, then yeah, I think that can correct misapprehensions that you have about him, although it doesn't exactly like negate all the negative things that he did, which are like maybe are enough to justify thinking of him as being like a pernicious, harmful person in right-wing political culture.
So, could you explain? This is something that relates to evolution, but it might be somewhat relevant to what's going on right now. Could you explain the concept of the Cambrian explosion and what it was?
The Cambrian explosion. Yeah, so I talked about this in my essay too. So, um, several hundred million years ago, there was a major extinction. And after that, I think partly because of rise in oxygen levels in the atmosphere, there was a huge explosion of new species and new body plans. And so the Cambrian explosion is when you had this uh, huge rise in the number of organisms and in new classes of organisms and new body plans. And so what I suggest in my essay is that we're living right now through what I call the cultural Cambrian explosion, which is like it's because of new media, social media, the ways in which the internet provides lots of different new ecological niches, lots of new ways of slicing up our social lives, that you get the explosion of new kinds of culture. It's a kind of explosion of cultural diversity that is parallel to the explosion of biological diversity hundreds of millions of years ago during the Cambrian explosion. So, you know, um, you get different little political subcultures, but of course you get lots of other cultures that don't have anything to do with politics, like video game cultures and furry cultures and people who are really into some cultural niche that you've never even heard of. And I think, the internet with all of the space and all the ways of connecting us that it affords, um, has led to this explosion of new subcultures that are really totally distinct and alien to one another.
Do you think that the monoculture that America had during, say, the 80s and 90s, do you think that's preferable to all of the vast, diverse subcultures that we have today?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that it's very hard to say, and that what's much clearer is that each brings its own problems. I think that in a society that is highly culturally fragmented, it will be very hard to communicate with each other, very hard to cooperate. You'll get more polarization, especially including about political issues. It'll be much harder to cooperate, to find common ground, and so on. On the other hand, monocultures have their own problems as well. I mean, you'll have less polarization, more common ground, but the place that people find common ground about might be harmful and pernicious. I mean, for example, you think of the monoculture that existed in the middle of the 20th century was one that was patriarchal and racist and xenophobic. This is the time and place where most white people thought that it was wrong for white people to get married to black people. So there can be lots of agreement, common ground, but less exploration of um, of of different and more progressive and more attractive moral and political views. So I think it's a great question. I guess I'm not sure how to like really compare them. I think each has its own virtues and its own costs, its own pitfalls.
Do you think that the Overton window in modern day American intellectual spaces, would you consider it to be a better or worse Overton window compared to say the monoculture of the 80s and 90s?
I think in some ways the Overton window back then was wider, although it was also narrower about certain like, you know, gay marriage was not within the Overton window. Um, Thinking about
Most trans issues that people talk about nowadays. Yeah.
right would not have been within the Overton window. Um, but I think there's a mistake that I maybe both of us have been making in this discussion so far, which is to think of it as the Overton window. I think like different communities have different Overton windows, different ranges of ideas and opinions that are worth taking seriously. And what happens in a world where there is this fragmentation and lots of different subcultures that are different from and separated from one another is that each one has its own Overton window, right? And so I think that uh, uh, in many ways the Overton window was probably there was there was less a narrower range of Overton windows in the monoculture that existed many decades ago. It was possibly wider, uh, though it was also like shifted to the right in ways that we think are unfortunate in hindsight. And nowadays, I think it really depends on what subculture you're talking about and how big the window there. I mean, it may be that in general, the Overton windows that you see nowadays are narrower than the ones that were existed in the monoculture. But I think that they're narrower in some places than others. I think that in the intellectual spaces on the left, they're quite narrow. I think for many people who are not political extremists, they're not so narrow, and they might well be for many people nowadays wider than they were than the monoculture that existed many decades ago. So I think it's hard to answer that question in part because there are different Overton windows, and some of them that are around right now are narrow, and some of them are wide.
Do you think that the Overton window within academia specifically is a lot more narrow compared to a lot of other Overton windows within other subcultures, whether it be journalism or like random subreddits or and so on and so forth?
I think the conversation that we've had so far and what I've said so far may suggest that I think that the intellectual left has a narrower Overton window than other spaces. And I'm not sure that's true, actually, because I think what I really think is that intellectuals and academics should have a very wide Overton window, and that what they have right now is too narrow compared to what it should be. But it may be that people outside of academia also have narrow Overton windows. It's just that as academics and intellectuals, we have a particular responsibility to um, to take views seriously that may be harder for people who have limited experiences and backgrounds, who are not conditioned to have open-minded debates, who don't have like cultural incentives to do that. So, I'm really unsure. You're raising an interesting question about making comparisons between different cultures, whose Overton window is larger or narrower. And I think I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think that it's really an empirical question. I'd love to see some data about. What I'm much more confident of is that, um, regardless of any comparisons, the Overton window in intellectual academic culture is narrower than it should be. We should take more seriously a wider range of opinions, and we are too quick to dismiss people, um, and to treat people as having views that are beyond the pale.
What are some examples of intellectual positions or political positions that you think should be part of academia's Overton window to a greater extent than it currently is?
Yeah, so we talked about one before, which is like various trans issues, things like participation of women in trans women in women's sport, self-ID surrounding women's prisons, women's shelters. So that's one. But let me give you another one. I think that affirmative action is another one that people on the left have increasingly adopted a very narrow perspective on. That is, unwilling to listen to arguments from people on the other side. I mean, so, basically what we're talking about is the practice of treating diversity as a consideration in student admissions, in employment, including employment in academia. So, I think there's a good case to be made that there's been this practice, at least in America, of admitting students because of their race or ethnicity, in part, um, hiring assistant professors partly on the basis of their race or ethnicity, or partly on the basis of their gender. And I think that when I've seen people question this practice, including myself, when I've raised questions about this practice on social media, the response is anger, accusations, extreme uncharity. So, for example, I raised a question about this on social media once, and people said, "Oh, this person thinks that women are hired regardless of their qualifications." It's like, well, no, I mean that's not what I was saying. What I was saying is that like gender is treated as one consideration among many, and it's not that you would hire somebody who's totally unqualified just because they're a woman or just because they're a person of color. So there's like this extreme uncharitable response. There is no room for thinking that there might be problems with this practice, even from a progressive perspective. So, for example, one of the questions I wanted to raise about this is like, maybe it's bad for um, the beneficiaries of affirmative action because maybe it reinforces the view that people who are um, Black or Hispanic or people who are women in academia are less qualified than white men. So maybe ultimately affirmative action harms the people that it's intended to benefit. And I think, maybe I'm wrong about that. It's a tough question for sure. But I think that's the kind of question where really people on the left are very reluctant to have open conversations about. And it's not just that they're violating their social obligations. Like they're obligated to take seriously people who disagree with them, but they're harming themselves intellectually because they don't know whether their own view is correct unless they stress test it, unless they consider what the strongest objections are to their view, unless they consider why people who disagree with them, why people disagree with them. Like what's the view that people have on the other side? You'll never know if you paint those people as villains having, the stupidest version of the view that is possible instead of really trying to understand what they think and why.
All right, so then I want you to stress test your own opinion. What are
Mhm.
some good counter arguments you've heard to what you just said about the limits of affirmative action?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, okay, so let's just make sure we're talking about something um, specific. So I'm talking about affirmative action in academic hiring. That
Yeah,
is
so
treating,
not like college admissions for students.
right,
Yeah.
not college admissions, not employment in other areas outside academia. I'm talking about treating the applicant's gender or their race or ethnicity as one consideration among many in hiring. Now, I just told you like one argument against that, which is like maybe that actually harms people of color and women because it um, uh, reinforces and justifies pernicious stereotypes about them because like people think, oh, well, we're doing affirmative action, that must mean that they're actually not as qualified as white men. So one kind of counterargument that I think is worth taking seriously um, is whether this practice of treating race or gender as a consideration is actually a way of not of tipping the scales, but of rebalancing them. Like if generally people on hiring committees are just are prejudiced against people of color or prejudiced against women, then maybe they're like not assessing their work fairly. Um, they're biased when they read their CVs or they read some of their publications. And so treating race or gender as a positive consideration is a way of like actually not tipping the scales, but rebalancing them, like counteracting some of these biases. I think that's totally possible. I mean, one of my main views about this is that what we need to do is to really have some really reliable empirical studies about these questions. And I
You
think one of
don't.
the problem,
Are you saying that the current studies on affirmative action, you don't consider them to be reliable?
well, I think that in general, when you have, when academic culture is filled by, 90% of people are from the left to the center left, and we're talking about politically very loaded questions that people are studying, or they're studying questions that feed into answering these politically loaded questions, I think generally we should have a lot of suspicion about that research because I think people on the left are very reluctant to frame studies in ways that might challenge cherished political views. They're very likely to ignore evidence that might challenge those views. So I think that really what we need to answer these kinds of politically loaded questions is what is called adversarial collaboration, which is when you have researchers with different political orientations, different prior hypotheses. They agree on a study design, they agree on a study way of analyzing the results, and then they accept the results, whatever they happen to be. So I think we need a lot more political diversity among the researchers to produce really trustworthy research. But I don't want to lose the thread of what we were talking about earlier, which is like, hey, listen, maybe affirmative action is just a way of balancing the scales rather than tilting them. And I think that's possible. I think we need better research, like I was just saying. But I also think the research that we do have suggests that that is not true. So there is an adversarial collaboration about this very issue. Um, what it does, it looked at it compared men and women on the academic job market, and what it found, in short, is that men and women with different qualifications, sorry, with similar qualifications, the women were much more likely to be hired into tenure track positions. So I think, in fact, like when you hold the qualifications the same, it's not the case that search committees are biased against women. In fact, it may be the opposite, that search committees are biased against men, and maybe it's because they're enacting this kind of affirmative action. But I mean, that's one study. It doesn't address race. I'm totally open to the possibility that that further studies that look at other demographic categories might vindicate this view that actually affirmative action in academic hiring is a way of balancing the scales. I think that's an open question. I think that we won't know whether it's true unless the proponents of that view take seriously people with different political orientations who disagree with them and try to figure out what the strongest objections are to their position.
You've told me before that generally the people within your social circle are like people in academia who tend to range from center left to far left. So there's a huge range of disagreement between people on the center left and the far left, even if the
Mm,
Overton window is still too narrow. So like
mm.
I'm assuming like this, I guess this is a straightforward yes or no question. Do you think we should expand the Overton window to allow conservatives more of a voice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, yeah. So there's lots of reasons to do this, but one of them is that the university system is funded by the public in lots of ways. And I'm not just talking about public universities that get their, I'm talking also about private universities that are funded by government programs like the NIH and the NEH. And so I think that if you want public support to the academic system, you have to reflect to some degree the range of political views that you see in society. So I think that, I mean, I'm not sure that we should do affirmative action for conservatives. That's a
That's
tough question.
that's what I was going to ask
But
you.
yeah, well, let's get to that in a second. But I do think that apart from that, um, you know, we should try to reform our culture so that people who have conservative leanings, whether they're culturally conservative or they're free market libertarians or so on, and whether they're conservative about all issues or just some issues, our culture should be one in which those people feel free to express their views and not to self-censor so that we can have open and intellectually productive discussion, more open and more intellectually productive discussions.
So maybe like, sorry, go ahead.
No, well, you were going to ask me about affirmative action for conservatives, but
Yeah, do you think we should
yeah.
do you think we should engage in affirmative action on behalf of conservatives as a way to add more viewpoint diversity to college campuses?
I mean, I'm skeptical, and I guess I'm skeptical for many of the reasons why I think that I'm skeptical about affirmative action for women and racial and ethnic minorities, which is I think like that might harm the conservatives in ways like reinforce negative stereotypes that left people on the left have about conservatives. I mean, I also think like, these are not just make work programs. We're not just trying to like, oh, make people like um have get people from a wide range of backgrounds employment in this system so that they can have a nice life teaching people. Like academic research matters. Teaching matters. We want the best qualified people who can do the best research and teach students who are highly qualified teachers. So you lose something when you shift away from a meritocracy. Now, that being said, and I talk about this in my essay on affirmative action too, sometimes identity can contribute to merit because sometimes um, your identity can clue you in to a wider range of ideas and considerations because of your background and because of the different culture that you belong to. So, for example, just to talk about conservatives, I mean, I think that in psychology, Jonathan Haidt and many others have talked about this. Having very few conservatives has distorted psychological research because we don't understand the conservative mind. There's really these like really caricatured views of what conservative feeling and thought is like because the research is mostly carried out by progressive. So I think like if there are cases where somebody's conservative background really informs their research and makes them a better researcher, then yeah, we should, that's a good reason to hire them. But it's not just because of their identity. It's because of the way in which their identity contributes to their research or contributes to their teaching.
All right, so we talk a lot about the fragmentation of American society and certain views that you think should be more a part of the Overton window. Let's zoom out a little bit. Give a more bird's eye view about the potential solutions that you would like to propose for how to ameliorate America's current fragmentation.
And yeah, if you just stick around past the paywall, we'll tell you all about how to how to solve these problems. I mean, it's $1 million question. I think that if uh, if I had the answer to that question, I'd be off trying to work with people to implement it because it's in some ways the most pressing problem that American society faces right now. I think there's lots of things that you can do as an individual to try to extract yourself from this fragmented system. But ultimately, what we need to do to not just change individuals, but change the culture is something quite drastic. We need to get people to reduce their hostility and animosity to people on from opposing political perspectives. We need people to consume a wider, more sober range of political analysis than they do. They need to stop watching 15-second clips and start reading 15-minute articles. Um, it's very hard to do all of that. And I think it's very hard in a society that is not just intellectually fragmented, but fragmented in physical space. Like there's this research, and I refer to it in my essay, which shows that more than ever before, people who are left wing and right wing are less likely to work at the same, work together, to go to school together, to live in the same neighborhoods. And ultimately, what we need is for people to be more integrated in their lives at school and work and play, and how to do that in a way that doesn't involve draconian social control is the big issue here. I mean, like, if you were God, you could just like get people to like mix together, and that's not really an option. One option that I've thought about is um, what if we had like a mandatory civil service program in this country for 18 to 20-year-olds? And it wasn't serving in the military, but it was doing something else. It was like doing something like Teach for America. And, people, or it was like helping people in their communities. And what the way the system worked is that it like randomly sorted people together. And so I think if you had that kind of system, you'd get people from the left and the right, um, working with each other, and then have to cooperate with each other to accomplish the tasks of this, that they're assigned in the system. And I think when people have to live and work together and when they have to cooperate, that reduces animosity. It builds trust. It builds mutual understanding. Then people can start to see where the other side is really coming from. They can stop being so uncharitable. They can, moderate some of their extreme views. And even if they don't moderate, they can still see the other side as like worthy of respect and worth and having views that are worth respecting and being people that are worth cooperating. So I think that's what we need to do, something like that radically integrates the left and the right in this country in a way that can reduce animosity and hostility and build mutual understanding.
Do you think that any such programs exist, or are we out of luck?
Well, we used to have the draft in this country, which did something like that. And I think that I don't think it's politically impossible for us to have this program of mandatory civil service. But I don't think that we currently have anything that functions like this. I mean, if we did, we wouldn't have this problem. Um, so, I'm very kind of pessimistic about this problem resolving on its own. I mean, I think we have all of this existing segregation between the left and the right in this country. We have this trend of education polarization. The left is voting Democrat and the right is voting Republican. And I think if left to its own, I think this problem of polarization and fragmentation will just continue. And we need some kind of new system to fight it. And maybe we can't do it all in one fell swoop, but we can experiment with ways of doing on a small scale level. Like, maybe, um, oh, I don't know, maybe in a certain state, if you do mandatory civil service, Teach for America, you get to go to college for free. And, there's like an incentive. Maybe it's not mandatory. So it's not mandatory. It's just like incentivized in one state. And maybe it has really positive results there and it starts spreading to other states. I mean, I think that we have to think about, realistic pathways to this kind of system.
Final question. Obviously, you're an academic. I'm sure you've had tons and tons of substantive political conversations with many people over the years. Do you have any examples of substantive disagreements that you've had with friends or coworkers that has inspired you to try to expand the Overton window in your line of work?
Hmm. I mean, I think some of my most inspiring experiences are less with colleagues and more with students. I think there is this stereotype of the American college student as someone who is trapped in their bubble and cannot have conversations with people outside of it. And I think it's maybe true of 10% of students at Harvard and other Ivy League institutions or other liberal arts colleges. But I think at most American colleges, um, the students are very open-minded. They're quite willing to have conversations with people who have very different views with them, including conservative students, which there are conservative students. I've had conservative students in my classes. And so I think sometimes I'm depressed by my colleagues, but inspired by my students and inspired that maybe the next generation will have the intellectual tools and the open-mindedness to reform some of the intellectual problems that we're experiencing right now, and to try to pry open this narrow Overton window.
Victor Kumar, thank you so much for taking the time to come onto this podcast.
Thank you. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, make sure to follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else that you get your podcasts from. Until next time, goodbye.